volunteers, we have that many for a reason, because we need that many. That's what allows us to serve as many people as we serve. And just coincidentally, last year we served 31,000 people. 31,000 children and adults got assistance, and we had 31,000 volunteers. Not exactly, it was like 30,900 and 31,200 on the other side, but phenomenal to be able to bring that many people together. And when people volunteer here, we spend time talking to them about what the issues are. Right? This is the crisis that is poverty, and this is the opportunity you have to help. So come on board and bring your friends, bring your family.
You really can work with what you know from your own work life and make those connections with people. So I think that if say, retirees or others who want to do volunteer work understood the kind of mutual interaction that you get through this volunteer work, that they might like to do it too. That would be my best recommendation. It's reciprocal. We're working together. This thing, poverty, is something people can work together to address.
So what are we doing? Right? It's not about celebrating our success. It's about saying that we can love better. This is really about how much are we going to love people. As aggressive as sometimes the tone can be, right? Or as urgent or as intense as the tone can be, this is still about loving one another. And there's no love in letting people live in poverty. And there's a lot of love in trying to help people get out and connecting with people. So this is about how much do we want to love each other.
What I get out of it, it's the satisfaction of seeing people open up, express themselves. I'm a teacher, you know, I'm a language arts English teacher, and I love to see self-expression. I love to see people learning. It's just really satisfying to me. And I've often in my life had chances to work with students who are up against challenges. Some of the folks I'm working with at Wider Circle are up against enormous challenges, bigger challenges than I've known in my life, and bigger than many of my students have addressed, especially people who are older, like people my age. So for me, having that kind of communication and feeling like that you're both growing through it is a huge reward, huge.
Up next on The Bottom Line, as we wrap up Black History Month, two special guests pay a visit to the council. We'll talk with Montgomery County resident Mike McCurry about how he's using his past work in politics in his new career.
Progressive left have to give up something. People on the conservative right have to give up something. We have to kind of try to find some place to meet in the middle.
Local leaders and community members take part in a discussion on the issues and fears facing our faith community.
Hate is trying to create something else. They want us to cease to exist. That's what they want, and they're using every element.
Thanks for watching, everyone. I'm Susan Kennedy. As we close out the month of February and Black History Month, the council welcomed two leaders in their own right. A young woman poised to make her mark, and the oldest living member of the Tuskegee Airmen. Described as one of the biggest honors of his career, Councilmember Duwando recognized Brigadier General Charles McGee for his 30 years of service to the United States as a member of the Tuskegee Airmen.
African-American members of this council in Black History Month this year, at this time in our country, to be able to stand here with you, sir, and honor all that you've done and meant for our nation, for everyone of every creed, race, religion, age, but particularly for us as African Americans. and African American men, the excellence that you have demonstrated over the course of your.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Monday, May 11th, 2020, Montgomery County Council meeting. We're going to begin, and I'm going to ask the clerk, Madam Clerk, do we have any changes to our agenda?
Good morning. Yes, we do have an addendum this morning. The council has added to the calendar point 5, consent calendar, introduction, special appropriation to the county government's FY20 operating budget, Department of Housing and Community Affairs, COVID-19 response, $4,399,899 for CDBG-CV and ESG-CV HUD CPD funding, source of funds, grant fund. Also, the council has deferred item number 4, community grants and MCG cost sharing. That will be rescheduled for 5/12/2020. Thank you, President Katz. That's all.
Thank you very much. And of course, as we know, 5/12/2020 is tomorrow, so it's rescheduled for tomorrow. Thank you, Madam Clerk. We need a motion to approve our consent calendar.
So moved.
It's been moved by Councilmember Navarro and seconded by Councilmember Reamer. All those in favor, please raise your hand. And that carries unanimously. Thank you very much. The next item that we have is several items that Councilmember Albornoz on the operating budget, the FY21 operating budget work session. And the first one is the Department of Health and Human Services. And Councilmember Albornoz, if you would please lead that for us.
Thank you, Mr. President, and belated Happy Mother's Day to all the mothers out there. Hope everybody had a restful day. It was beautiful, and hope everybody got to enjoy a little bit of that outdoor time. So I want to begin by just acknowledging the incredible work, the absolutely incredible work of our county's Health and Human Services Department all the time, but especially over the last 2 months. My colleagues and I have had the benefit of getting updates periodically from HHS regarding their operation. And much of the work that has gotten the headlines is straightforward, related specifically to COVID, but a lot of the work has not gotten a lot of the headlines, but is equally as important. Supporting our nonprofit sector, expanding services internally, administratively, and creatively to meet the unique needs of providers, and really continuing their work on the front lines in a large and significant ways. And so I want to thank Dr. Crowell and his entire team, and by extension, all of the community-based organizations and nonprofits who contract through the Department of Health and Human Services and are doing their best to hold the line on our social safety net and be able to move us forward. They are all heroes in my book, and I just want to start from that space and acknowledging that incredible leadership, and I know all of my colleagues share the same exact sentiments. I also want to thank Linda McMillan for once again putting together an extraordinary packet, and her decades of experience on the council are invaluable for all of us, particularly now as we're going through this unique process in the manner in which we budget, not having been able to meet as committees. And so, Linda, thank you for your dedication. The headline here is that a number of the recommended items not included because of the very reasonable and correct approach we've taken with regards to continuity of service are painful. Because as we know, many of these issues directly cross over into the county's response and will be important moving forward. And so just as we have with other critical functions within county government, I just want to lead with the headline that a number of these issues will be revisited as quickly as possible once we have a better sense of what the fiscal outlook looks like and what exactly we are dealing with in terms of the response to COVID and how we are addressing those social safety net and public health issues that we know have already arisen and are only going to grow moving forward. And so there will be a lot of disappointment in the short term from a lot of important stakeholders and partners in this discussion. But as we go through these line item by line item, the headline I again want to underscore is we hear you, we understand the concerns and the issues you are dealing with, and this council stands ready in partnership with the executive branch to address as many of those issues and as quickly as we possibly can. So I just wanted to sort of share that up front. And with that, I now turn it over to Ms. McMillan to walk us through the packet. And there will be one item in particular among the ones that have been recommended that we not move forward, that I will be moving that we do move forward, which I will better explain as we go through the respective line items. But Ms. McMillan, and the last thing I should say is normally the HHS committee would have met about 8 or 9 times to go through this entire packet. And so obviously, as is the case with all of the respective committees, this is, we've adapted to the times, but just to acknowledge and underscore that context as well. But Ms. McMillan, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Councilmember Albornoz. Are you all able to hear me?
We are. We can hear you.
Okay, great. I want to reiterate what Councilmember Albornoz has already mentioned, but also to remind people that the council has also been addressing many of the health and human services needs through the series of special appropriations that you have already approved, and those have been for things like financial assistance, food, housing, hospital support. So the council is dealing with these different than we have in past years, but is paying attention to all those issues. And I know we will revisit many of the items in this packet as soon as possible. So with that, I would just say that the FY21 executive recommendation for the 2 funds, HHS has a grant fund and a general fund, is about $348 million. I would just start actually a little bit on the backward side, which is to say that in terms of a continuity of services framework for the grant fund, council staff is not recommending any change from the county executive. The grant fund is about $87 million. It has an $8 million increase. Your packet does show the changes in the grant. The state and federal grants are an important funding source for the county, particularly in the behavioral health and crisis services area. They often move in large amounts because they can cross over fiscal years and have an appropriation that crosses over, but they reflect what the county either has already received or expects to receive. And so continuity of services, the council staff recommendation is to approve the grant fund as proposed. And that leads us to the changes in the general fund. Council staff took a pretty firm approach to continuity of services, and so is recommending a $9.8 million reduction to the general fund to have continuity for the continuity of services framework. On page 2 of your memo, there is a listing of those things that are not included in a continuity of services framework, and I think these are many of the issues that HHS Chair Albornoz already has alluded to that the HHS committee would have discussed over multiple work sessions and that have been very important to the council over the years, and those have to do with things like providing services to the developmentally disabled and adult medical daycare providers and the nonprofit contracts, wellness centers. We can talk about these as much as the council wants to. They're also not included in the continuity of services recommendation are some substantial increases to to funding for services to end and prevent homelessness, to provide additional capacity for the strategic plan. And so I would just say that we can go through those as you like. I would point out for you that within the continuity of services budget recommendation, there is a $2.9 million addition to the HHS base budget, which is from community grants being moved into the base budget. That there is a listing at the last 2 pages of your packet of what those grants are. I know that tomorrow you'll have a broader discussion of grants, but in this budget, it is a substantial dollar addition, although they are grants that previously were in the non-departmental account but administered by the Department of Health and Human Services. And also within continuity of services, just to highlight for you, because the provision of food is such a critical issue, there is $100,000 as the county match for the summer supplemental SNAP program. With that, I think I would like to get your thoughts about how you would like to move forward with the specific items in the packet.
Thank you, Ms. McMillan. What I'd like to do is begin by focusing on that second page you referenced, which I think succinctly gives an overview of those items that were not recommended move forward, but were recommended in the executive's budget proposal, and highlight several of them in particular, and certainly entertain any questions that our colleagues may have regarding any of those respective items. So that will be sort of the first phase. And then in a second phase, if there are any items not on this list that my colleagues would like to highlight or bring to the attention of all of us, then by all means, we should certainly do that. But I wanted to start with what Ms. McMillan just discussed with regards to our developmental disability community. Last year, the council did put back money that was not recommended to be moved forward to help supplement and support organizations who have had to pay staff, and as the county has phased in the higher minimum wage, which is absolutely the appropriate thing to do, and I think a model for the entire region and the rest of the country, but understandably that has created some challenges within these respective organizations, because the rate at which they are reimbursed for their services is set on not the county's minimum wage, but is actually set at the federal level. And so it puts those organizations in a disadvantage in being able to carry out their services. And so through a partnership, the county has moved forward the ability to supplement those funds to ensure that those organizations are made whole and not disproportionately impacted because of the critical services that they provide to this very, very, very high needs and special population. And so there was a recommendation in the executive's budget to expand that to include the fact that there is the next phase of that minimum wage to be implemented in the upcoming year. And understandably, we've heard from organizations within the disability space who are concerned if those funds are not added, that not only will they not be made whole, but they've had to expand services because of COVID and expand the hours of operation to meet the demand, but also to increase their staffing capacity because they've had a lot of staff get sick and not be able to report to work. And so they've had to increase staffing in order to address that. Because of the continuity approach, we are not recommending right now, right today on this date, that this be included, but this absolutely will be one of the items that we revisit in June once we have a better picture and understanding of what the fiscal situation is. And so I wanted to highlight that item in particular for my colleagues because I know it's understandably generated a lot of discussion in the community among these incredible providers. And I wanted that message to go out to our providers that this will be revisited. So that's one. The second issue I'd like to bring to the attention of my colleagues, and this one I would like to move that we consider to be added to the list for discussion at the end, And for context, we have discussed that items that draw the straightest line between staffing issues and COVID response would be items that we would consider. And you can argue very much, and that's why it's going to be a priority, that the disability community is directly related to COVID. But there is an item that I think is of particular concern, and that is our school health nurse program. There is a proposal for an addition of 10 school health nurses. And as my colleagues know, the school health nurses have been something that this council has supported extensively over the years. And in fact, we were able to place through a special appropriation funding to bring us to a higher level within this past fiscal year. We know that our school health nurses do a lot, but as schools reopen, and whatever that looks like and whenever that may be, our school health nurses are very much going to be on the front lines in tracking, students and whether or not they and the impact of students potentially having the virus coming to school. They're also going to play a leading role in terms of how each school individually responds to this crisis. And we know that a number of our school health nurses, by virtue of their jobs and by virtue of where they are in terms of categories of being within at-risk populations, as they go down, if they get sick or somebody in their family gets sick and they're not able to report to work, we were already in a compromised position from the staffing levels even before COVID. And so very much like the discussion we had early on in this budget process with our firefighters and the support for the possible support for moving forward the firefighter class, it's a similar issue with our school health nurses. And so for those reasons, and then finally, our school health nurses right now are working with our public health office and being dispatched as part of the rapid response teams within nursing homes and by extension group homes. And so while school is not in session, our school health nurses are just doing an absolutely fantastic job of addressing the needs of our community. And so I wanted to move that we restore the school health nurses and not go with the staff recommendation, but go with the executive recommendation, acknowledging that this is something that will have to be reconciled and revisited. And it could be that we look at a fall start date for these positions, but onboarding them as quickly as possible, I think, is going to be very important to our overall response.
Second.
So, thank you.
Second.
And so I open it up. I turn it back over to you, Council President. I will come back to discuss some other items, but on this specific item, I defer to you to facilitate the discussion.
Thank you very much, and I'm not surprised that you have a few other things to say. Councilmember Friedson.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate the proposal and all of the significant work that the HHS chair and HHS committee, many other council members have put into a number of these critical issues, and Linda McMillan in particular as well. I did just want to raise, and I do hope that we can come back to this significant conversation about the impact of the minimum wage on our DD providers, adult daycare providers, other nonprofits in particular. I really do think it's critical that we come back to this important topic. I think we have to recognize that this does have a significant impact, that major commitments were made to these organizations, that as we work to lift up workers in the county, which is a very important and laudable goal, that we not do it at the expense of the most vulnerable in our community and those serving the most vulnerable in our community with these organizations. Now is not the time to discuss that, but I think it's important that it be raised because it is very relevant to this particular conversation. And so I appreciate that that was briefly noted by Councilmember Albornoz, and I think that it's very important that we do come back to that particular item. I also think that there are a number of issues within this packet and within these organizations that we make sure that we make the organizations whole for the grant funding and services that they are providing on behalf of the county, and we make sure that there aren't circumstances where we do a continuity of services budget, but do not put our organizations in a position to be able to afford to maintain a continuity of service, particularly for those who are most vulnerable in our community. I think that's an ongoing conversation that we're going to have as we complete this budget and as we move forward into June and beyond. And I just hope that we all commit, as I know we will, to fleshing out that conversation and making sure that our critical partners serving our residents are made whole and are allowed and empowered to provide the critical services that they do on a regular basis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councilmember Rice.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you, Councilmember Albornoz, for your great recognition of, I think, what is going to be a part of our rebuilding structure when it comes to our schools. Look, with over 163,000 students throughout the system, it is one in which there's no question, however we return to school, health is going to be paramount, and these nurses are going to be on the front lines of identifying and making sure that we're staving off any kind of infections in our schools. And so from that perspective, while this is just the small tip of the iceberg when it comes to what we'll need, I think we're going to need much larger teams in our schools. So this is just a down payment on what I think is going to be a much larger iteration of what we'll need to really make sure that we're keeping our students and our faculty and staff that are in our schools safe. So from that perspective, I completely support it. I think that, again, it's going to be key for us to really build out a robust strategy of how we respond in positive cases in our schools, all of those kinds of things. And so that will come, but this is the first step in that process. So thank you, Councilmember Albornoz, for recognizing the importance of this.
Thank you. Councilmember Navarro.
Thank you, Mr. President. I do want to highlight that in our conversations about continuity of operations, we did say, and it's in the resolution, that we would take consideration and give consideration to those areas that are directly related to COVID-19. I think it's very true, though now we're thinking ahead on what will take place. So I want to remind everybody that, to me, the HHS budget in particular is going to play an outsized role in how we manage the continuation of this crisis, but also as things begin to open up very gradually. And we should figure out, again, I assume at some point we're going to be briefed about the $183 million, but we need to have some conversations about how we're treating these HHS items for further consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Reamer.
Thank you. I want to thank the committee chair for his incredible work on everything related to HHS at this time, and also for this recommendation. I think this is a good one. I think we're gonna find that school health nurses, we're appreciating a significant value in having more school health nurses that perhaps we hadn't imagined a year ago. But having the ability to have a very broad community response to a health crisis, it's supported by the more health personnel you have. So I agree with Chair Rice's comments that we're going to have to do a lot more. Obviously, hopefully we can fund a lot of that through the COVID funding, but yet another value here in our school health nurses. So I definitely agree with this recommendation.
Thank you. Councilmember Glass.
Thank you, Mr. President. I too want to commend Chairman Albornoz for the thoughtfulness in the approach for which we look at the HHS budget and everything that is in it. A lot of these things are leading indicators of issues that we know that we're addressing now, but we'll have to address a lot more moving forward. School nurses is one of those issues as we try to figure out what the new normal will be in our educational institutions and MCPS. Some of the other items that are going to be discussed, are also regarding rental subsidies and housing needs, which are front of everybody's minds as well. and some of them don't necessarily square with the same services budget, but as was just said, they are most definitely COVID related, as the anxiety and economic situation right now continues to manifest. And so with regard to the school nurses, absolutely support that, but there's this isn't going to be an ongoing conversation for sure, because of the huge nature of this department and all of the important work and social safety net items that it provides our community. So thank you.
Thank you. And I too support this. And I also obviously applaud the Councilmember Albornoz for a lot of reasons, not just this one, but especially for this one. We have said all along that school nurses are very, very necessary, and that we are certainly have shown that by our supplemental. And as far as the coming back in June for the developmentally disability community, I think it is very necessary that we have a definite date that we're coming back in June. The minimum wage for Montgomery County starts July 1. We need to make certain that our communities are whole. We said we would do that all along, and we need to stand by our commitment as well. And this is a continuity of services for that community. What we're doing is saying that we will afford them the additional funds when it is necessary. And with that, I have, I think, no other speakers for this topic. And if I'm wrong, somebody's going to jump up and down and let me know. It's been moved by Councilmember Albornoz, seconded by Councilmember Rice. All those in favor, please raise your hand. And that is Councilmember Reamer. Are you frozen again?
He is frozen.
Frozen again. Same thing.
Well, unless I hear from Councilmember Reamer, since he spoke in favor of it, I'm going to say his vote will be in the affirmative. I have a feeling we will hear from him shortly. That carries unanimously. Thank you. And we're going to turn to Councilmember Albornoz.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also want to mention, and I'm going to, in 30 seconds, give the floor to Dr. Crowell, which I should have done at the beginning, falling victim to choosing the view of only seeing my colleagues. But in a second, I'm going to defer to Dr. Crowell to make some comments. But I want to also stress, similar to the developmental disability community, adult medical day providers are already a critical resource. But I think moving forward, as we look at the nursing model and the model that we currently have in place, particularly with our older adult populations, we're going to have some very difficult conversations moving forward on the practicality of that model in light of everything that's happening right now with COVID. And adult medical daycare providers are a tremendous resource, but will be even more so moving forward, I think, as an important solution to provide critical care to our aging community. And they also will be, when we come back in June, will be very much a part of that conversation as well. But with that, apologies, Dr. Crowell, I should have turned over to you at the beginning of this discussion, but would like to do that now. And thank you once again, sir. I know you're not sleeping a lot these days, but I really appreciate your dedication and would like to defer to you to make some opening comments.
Thank you, Councilmember Albornoz and Chair Albornoz for the committee. And good morning, everyone. Let me start by saying a heartfelt thank you for all the support and all the hard work. I know that I am not the only person who is losing sleep and working 7 days a week in this process. So one of my staff members commented that every day now feels like Tuesday. So it is, and looking for the weekend, and it just never seems to come. We just roll from one thing into the other. I want to also thank you for the vote you just took on school health nurses. I think that they are going to be a vital piece of what we do in the coming year, and an essential element of what we do as we bring all of our programs back online and deal with our children and the impact that this has had on them, and try to get back to some sense of normal for them. I think I want to also say that this is not how I envisioned spending my first year as director of the Department of Health and Human Services. I had this other thought on my mind about access navigation, effective and supportive staff, and an equity and a model for equity across the service. Those are still my touch points, and it's been both, whether we're in emergency and through recovery. Those are still my touch points for what I want to get to and the things I want to work on going forward. I need to recognize some things in response and dealing with this response mode that we've been in. The work of public health, the service area of public health, it doesn't need much comment from me. You all have seen that work and know daily what they are doing in public health, what Dr. Gales and his team are doing in public health. But I want to call out CEF for the work that they have been doing on homelessness and housing and keeping folks in our shelters safe and protected from infection and COVID. And not only, when I say CEF, I'm talking not just about CEF, but the partners that we have that we're working with. It is a vast array of folks that are making this work for us, not just the folks in the department, but I've got a team that are really doing amazing things. Our aging and disability staff have been really on the front lines of working with folks in nursing homes and in DD communities. They have done a fantastic job and are now joining with Dr. Gales and doing contact tracing in some of our congregate settings. The Crisis Center and Behavioral Health have stayed open. We have a team that has stayed up in the corrections space, one of the most impacted spaces in county service in terms of positive cases of COVID-19 and congregate facilities. Our Office of Eligibility and Support Services under Joanne Barnes has continued to work, and I will show you something in a moment that I wanted to share with you about that. But the doors are closed to the public, but the service is far from closed. Folks are online and calling in daily. Our Children, Youth, and Family Services are still doing work on getting out emergency cash assistance and constantly trying to make sure that the communities have access to what we need. Office of Community Affairs is working with our Public Information Office to make sure that our communities of color are being reached and communicated with. I think that, and we've got staff from all across the department working with the Food Council to make sure that people don't go hungry and get fed. There is a lot going on. You all know a lot about that. I think what feels like many months ago, we started en masse teleworking. And that would not have been possible without the effort of our IT teams that have been working behind the scenes that people never see and never get a chance to say thank you to. But they have been really busting their chops to get our people out the door. 1,800 people in Department of Health and Human Services, 1,700 people in Department of Human Services. 80% of them are out telework. And as a result of the work that this team has done and the staff, we are really at a very low level of folks who've been exposed and had to isolate and quarantine or been positive. So I'm incredibly proud of the work that they have done and will continue to do in response to COVID-19. I also wanted to say one other thing that this, as we look at recovery, and I think I want to share my screen for just a moment if you all will indulge me. Let's see if I can do it this way. This one. And push that all the way up like that. There we go. This is something one of my staff members put together that looks at 2019 versus 2018 volume since we shut down. And what you see across the top end of this is where we're the first wave of what I think will be a surge of need coming across HHS's desks and through our doors. Our emergency support services, the need for public assistance benefits are soaring. It looks like when you look down below the red line, the things are less than last year, but that has more to do with the things that we've put on emergency status, on an emergency footing, than I think the need. And I think we're going to see that climb as we go forward into this year. So as the health surge declines, what will increase is going to be the surge of human service needs that we can expect. I am a couple of things, and I'll stop because I think we're going to go through this package, but there are a couple of things that I wanted to point out and just raise. Councilmember Albornoz has talked about the DD and the adult medical daycare requests that are in this line items that are in this proposal, and I think there are a couple of things that I want to share with folks. One is that there is you're also considering not supporting a 1.5% inflationary adjustment. You're talking about the no increase to DD and adult daycare providers. Minimum wage is going into effect on July 1. You've heard. I think the other one is that we're talking about adding additional providers. I think that's in your packet as well, which would mean that the existing subsidy would be further split across the existing array of providers. And then the last piece of this is that Governor Hogan vetoed SB 796, which means that the process for going into LTSS and a change in how they are paid at the state level is going to make that an even greater challenge for these two groups in particular. These add up to a functional cut in folks that are doing work on front lines in congregate settings and in communities where we are at great risk. I think the adding all that combined, plus the difficulty of recruiting and retaining staff in an environment that is increasingly risky because of COVID-19 as we go into the fall and into winter seasons, is something I would ask you to consider. The other pieces, as we get to it, are the rental subsidy pieces. I'll say it now, we can talk more about it later, but I think we are also looking at for folks who are at risk of losing homes, losing their spaces, because they've lost jobs. These subsidies sometimes are the thing that keep people on the margins, in housing. They have not been increased for a significant period of time, and that needs some consideration, as does our effort to do rapid rehousing to get folks out of shelter and back into housing as quickly as they can. I think overall, I think the idea of a continuity of services budget is an important one, and one you all have to take, the position we have to take. I would say to you that this pandemic has exposed some critical cracks in our healthcare service field, in health and in human services fields, that are going to be with us for a while and need some repairing. A continuity of services budget in this regard is a risk of reduction and risk of perpetuating some of those cracks. The last thing I'll say, and then I'll stop on this, is that as you think about the DD and adult medical daycare providers, recognize that revisiting this in June may be timely, but they're working on their budgets for next year now. And they have to work on their budgets, assuming minimum wage increases and all the things that I've mentioned come July 1, which means they will have to make some decisions. They're making decisions now about how they will manage this process going forward. So a delay in that may be more costly than we realize. So I'll stop there. And again, I just want to say thank you to you all. This is a lot of hard work, and this is an unusual budget cycle with some painful choices that council has to make. I realize that, and I think that there's a need to take a scalpel to this process as you think about what you need to support and what you cannot support going forward. Thank you.
Dr. Kraut, thank you so much for those comments. They were so important, and the context, again, for our key stakeholders that are out there is that we know that those decisions are being made now. The challenge is reconciling a number of moving pieces within this very large operating budget relative to just about every department and agency that's out there, and monitoring revenue coming in with potential savings. And that's why continuity of service is a baseline. But as we've acknowledged publicly, and as Councilmember Navarro has said, probably better than anybody, that this is a baseline that we are going to adjust as necessary as quickly as possible. And all of the categories you just mentioned are among our highest priorities to adjust once we have a better sense of what that picture looks like. And so we're going to work this week on putting on the calendar as early in June as humanly possible, addressing each and every one of those items. But because there are so many challenges right now, we want to give ourselves the flexibility of being able to do that once we have a better sense of the environment that we're working from. So I want to assure those organizations that they are at the top of the list in terms of priority, and we will be revisiting it as soon as humanly possible to give them as much runway as we can in order to plan for the future. But we are here to help, and we will help. But you raised a lot of very good points. There is one other line item that I'd like to discuss, Mr. President, before turning over to my colleagues to discuss any of the other items that are on the list for discussion. And I know rental assistance is one that my colleagues have also wanted to talk about and move forward. But there is a line item specifically for trauma-informed programming, specifically for youth. And I just want to highlight that there is some really incredible work going on right now, both within the Recreation Department as well as our Street Outreach Network, and reaching those particularly vulnerable and at-risk youth populations. And so there's overtime work going on right now to address the needs of our youth. And we're always concerned about that from a positive youth development standpoint, but in particular now. And so I know my colleague and friend, Councilmember Navarro, is working on a special appropriation specifically within the youth development space to help address this issue, which I know we are all concerned about. And that particular line item with regards to trauma-informed youth, we're envisioning be combined with that effort. Not ready for prime time yet, but I just wanted to highlight for that my colleagues and put an asterisk on that is another item that we will be revisiting and have a game plan to address in the very short term. With that, Mr. President, I will defer to you and see if any of my colleagues have any additional comments with regards to this second page of the budget and the items that have not been recommended by council staff be moved forward.
Thank you. Councilmember Navarro.
Thank you, Mr. President. And Councilmember Albornoz, thank you for bringing up and highlighting that particular item. As it was mentioned earlier, we're all trying to navigate the different approaches to this budget, recognizing the continuity of operations, but also recognizing that there are particular challenges happening in real time. And I believe that this is one of those areas where we can combine forces to provide that support and do it through a special appropriation, because it is very much tied to the COVID-19 response. So I appreciate your flexibility as well, and also want to shout out Street Outreach Network and all the nonprofit organizations working out. They are in the community right now, providing extraordinary support that sometimes we don't hear a lot about, but they're out there doing it, and that is a very important safety net component for our youth. So as soon as we get some language, et cetera, we'll be sharing with all my colleagues, working in conjunction with you, Councilmember Albornoz, so that we can also respond to this very pressing need. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just want to add my voice to that choir, that obviously it's needed. We need to come back as quickly as we can. And Street Outreach is an unbelievably good organization. And we also have so many nonprofits, and all of us can shake our head when we talk about identity and all the other organizations that are saving our youth literally on an hourly basis. So we need to come back to that as quickly as we can. With that, I have no other speakers. Councilmember Albornoz, did you want to make a motion?
I would. I'd like to move that we move forward with the staff recommendation with the amendments specifically regarding school health nurses, with the acknowledgement we're going to be revisiting all of this as soon as possible.
Thank you. And is there a second? I see Councilmember Rice giving that second sign. All those in favor, please raise your hand. Who are in favor? Those opposed? That carries unanimously. Thank you very much. Next is, I believe it's the Councilmember Albornoz, Councilmember Rice show. That's the next item is the early care and education non-departmental accounts, and I believe that's a joint committee. Councilmember Albornoz, would you like to lead it off? And
yes.
Rice, I know, will not be shy. Yeah.
No, yes, Mr. President. So Councilmember Rice and I did rock, scissors, paper virtually this morning, and so I will be just facilitating the first part of this discussion, and we'll turn it over to him in a second. But as we know, this council has been extraordinarily supportive of early care and education. And last year, under then Council President Navarro's tenure, in partnership with the executive branch, we were able to initiate what I think is an extraordinarily important strategic plan to get us to a point where we can provide early care and education to every young person in Montgomery County. And we know that this is an economic imperative. We know this is a moral imperative, but particularly now, as we transition back to life, whatever that will look like, it's going to be even more important for us to have critical services in place to support employees who need to get back to work and to help begin to address what we know has been created over the last few months and will be extended into the fall season, which is a gap in the learning that is currently occurring right now among many families. And so for all that and many more reasons, it will be important for us to continue this momentum. And I'll now defer to my colleague and friend, Council Chair Rice, and I'm sure Councilmember Navarro and others are going to have something to say about this too, and then turn it over to Vivian to walk us through the packet. But Councilmember Rice.
Well, thank you very much, Chair Albornoz, and certainly when it comes to Councilmember Navarro and Councilmember Reamer, who have been very passionate about early care and education, I really want to highlight the great work. You know, Councilmember Navarro has been in this space for a very long time that preceded her career here on the council, and so certainly defer to her in terms of her expertise and experience. But let me just say this. This is one in which I had said at the very beginning, we're going to have to come back to. There's no question that any type of recovery plan is going to involve early care and education for not just our first responders, but as folks get back to work. And we're going to need to make sure that those who couldn't afford it before are kept in mind when we have this new iteration. I mean, it's just a no-brainer. And so from that perspective, although it's painful to see us not doing what we had planned to do, the reality is we're going to have to do more than that. So, you know, the 1.4 seems great in the sense of that's what we were looking at as a modest way to keep us moving forward and expanding opportunity. But the reality is we're going to have to have a very robust way in which we're responding to the need that's going to be out there as we try and get folks back to work here in Montgomery County and this region and in this nation. And so from that perspective, you know, I feel very comfortable in moving forward with the recommendations that are here, understanding that in just a short period of time, we're going to address this on a much more holistic level altogether anyway. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. Councilmember Friedson.
Thank you very much. I just want to note, similarly to what has already been said, thank the leadership that's been shown for the previous council with Councilmember Navarro and Councilmember Reamer, who have really been pushing this issue, and the two chairs, Councilmember Albornoz and Rice, who really demonstrated their leadership on this joint committee. I know a number of us have been having ongoing conversations throughout this crisis as we talk about health and human services and the cracks that have been there the whole time, but have been amplified and expanded perhaps as a result of the vulnerabilities that have been demonstrated. Childcare is a perfect example of that, unfortunately, as Dr. Kroll mentioned earlier. And I just wanted to note that as we have previously really been focusing on the subsidies for families, which is critical, we now have a whole new challenge of making sure that there are actually organizations for those families to go back to. And there are some existential threats as a result of this crisis that threaten the organizations themselves of being able to stay operational and stay in business and make sure that we have facilities and organizations that can stay afloat in order to provide the type of early child care and education that is necessary. And so as part of this conversation, I know many of us are working on it. I look forward to being able to work together as a council and come up with a comprehensive solution. But I think we need to think really holistically about this issue and not only implement the really important plan that was put forward last year under Councilmember Navarro's presidency, but also reflect the new reality that we find ourselves in that has really challenged these organizations to make sure that we can keep them in business, keep them afloat, and make sure that they are there for the families who increasingly are going to need them. As we've all said before, this is not just a moral issue for our children and for our future, it's an economic issue. We can't get our economy back to recovery unless all of our residents can reach their economic potential and can go back to work, and that requires a really robust early child care system that is healthy and is working and is functional. and that's going to require significant leadership from this council. We've shown it before, and we're really going to have to show it as we move forward.
Thank you. Councilmember Navarro.
Thank you, Mr. President. So in hindsight, obviously, last year under my presidency, I had a number of areas that I really wanted to tackle, things that I've been thinking about for a very long time. This early care and education action plan, which is different than a strategic plan, but this is an action plan, was also part of the impetus for the economic development platform. In other words, I think that the work this council did to put forth important frameworks are going to be very useful now as well. I mean, nobody obviously envisioned that this was going to be happening right now in terms of this pandemic when we were doing that work. But I believe that that framework is going to help us. And all the comments thus far have been spot on. The reality is that we are going to have to do so much more in this space. It is very clear that things have shifted considerably. And there are particular centers who are struggling or don't know if they're going to come back. Let's think about the family child care providers right now who are absolutely in trouble and the need that will be there once we start reopening. So I think that this is one of those items that we would do it. We would not do it justice if we just adopted, what's there right now in the budget and the operating budget. But I do believe that and I heard this week, we would be briefed on, the CARES Act and how to use that money, et cetera. I think this is going to have to be such an important component. We need to, number one, take stock of where we are, what has been done thus far. I have questions about where we are because we did ask for updates that had to be, consistent to understand if we were meeting our goals. I think we need to take stock of where we are and then have, again, a very quick, I believe, process to figure out how we boost and enhance what we were doing thus far. So in some ways, I would say it's semi-good news because at least we do have frameworks in place, but we need to make sure that we focus on this razor sharp. This is going to be a component that is going to be critical for the economic recovery and also for the safety of these children, which is something that does keep me up at night, knowing that there are so many children right now who are not in quality childcare settings. So anyhow, I do agree with both Councilmember Rice and Albornoz. I look forward to helping out in any way as we now re-envision this particular action plan and put it into action immediately so we can help recover. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Reamer.
Thank you so much. Appreciate all the comments so far and the work that is ongoing. Just to add to the conversation, I really think we need to create a grant program like the Public Health Emergency Grant Program, but one that's just for child care providers. And we need to get them enough funding now on the front end of this recovery so that they can, confidently plan to open. I think probably the dilemma a lot of them are going to have is they have no idea how many of their students or their children are going to be re-enrolling. And we don't know, unemployment is high and people may not enroll their children in early education if they don't have employment. So it's going to be an extremely uncertain environment. And, anything we can do to provide funding on the front end, I think will really help them accelerate. So I'm eager to see a child care recovery strategy as soon as possible. I was actually hoping we would see some details here today, but we can follow up on that soon. But I think whether it's forward funding, all of the tuition vouchers that they may have planned to receive, or simply just providing a grant fund. But as Council Member Navarro said, if it's a home-based provider, that's their own mortgage that is on the line right now. Or if it's a center, then it's a lease, maybe a larger payroll. So there's just a lot of issues, and I think we need to really move quickly and with some significant funding so that our providers can reopen with confidence and to support the workforce. Thank you.
Thank you. I have no other speakers. Council members Albornoz and Rice, would someone like to make a motion?
Before we do that, I apologize once again. I did not give Dr. Crowell and now my understanding Bibi Ortero an opportunity to make some opening comments, and so I'd like to defer, Mr. President, to them to make some comments regarding this particular item. Dr. Crowell or Bibi, please.
Thank you, Councilmember. I'm going to turn this over to Bibi for a second because I know she has a few things to say about this and has been really very much in the forefront of working on ECEI. But I would say that all the things that I said to you all about the DD and the adult medical daycare provider as staffing and operation apply, I think, to our child care systems as we go forward. The plan and the action plan that Councilmember Navarro mentioned is a sound action plan that got essentially blown out of the water by COVID and the shutdown of childcare systems across the county. I think the challenge now for ECEI is to go back to the table and recraft what does it look like under recovery? What are the staffing issues? How are we going to get folks staffed back up, keep folks in business, but also even get families to a point where they're comfortable bringing their children back into the system? How do we train or retrain providers to deal with healthcare issues and safety precautions in a room with 4-year-olds and 3-year-olds where they are used to interacting up close and personal? All those things are going to have to be rethought as part of ECEI and our expansion for ECEI. I don't know whether or not it fits in the CARES Act funding or whether it's a FEMA issue. I feel like as I listen to this, we've spent $183 million about 4 times over. Or allocated it for spending about 4 times over. So this is an area that, as I think about recovery and health and human services groups, will be getting some special attention from me. And I'm going to be probably working hand in glove with you all and with Bibi. So that's our 2 cents from HHS. I'll leave it to Bibi to follow up.
Ms. Ortero.
Muchas gracias. It's good to see everybody. So let me add a couple of things to what Raymond said, and both at a local and state and national perspective. So you can imagine we're not the only ones that are struggling with this in Montgomery County, and this is really. I did provide Vivian a couple of articles that I hope she shares with you all, sort of at a national level of how people are thinking about recovery for early care and education. I think those are really helpful in trying to think about what are some of the initial steps around that. I think Raymond just said it very clearly that we don't know what parents are going to want. I think Hans, you raised that issue. We don't know what parents are going to be comfortable with. We don't know what they're going to need and want, depending on how the workforce rollout happens, right? In terms of people teleworking versus going to work, and whether parents, what safety measures parents are going to want. We have some idea from what we're seeing in the centers across the region that are providing essential employees childcare, and we are looking very closely at how those centers are working and how they're responding to the need and how they are. And what additional requirements those centers are having to put in place in order to make sure that parents, children, and staff are safe. And it is a huge amount of, I will walk you through a provider who walks in, a teacher who walks into the center, changes all of her clothes, puts them in a locker, puts on a uniform that is provided by the center that is washed every evening. That's just the teacher, right? The reduction of the number of children in a classroom so children, the saddest part for me was, and I spoke to a provider this weekend, little 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds who have been taught to say 6 feet apart, please, to their peers. Just the psychological and the developmental issues around that are huge. So there's, I could just layer on that all of the kinds of things that we're going to be dealing with the recovery. And you've heard me time and time again in these presentations talk about a business model that's broken. Well, that is not the ideal. And we're now seeing this nationally, that this childcare business, the way that the business of childcare functions is really broken. And I think there is an opportunity. And the opportunity is to see, do we do this and how do we do this differently? Childcare subsidies are, I think, going to be something that is going to, fortunately, for some of us who've been advocating around this, are going to make way for childcare contracts, so that folks have a contract as opposed to a set of subsidies for a number of children, because so many of our families now are going to be in need that we can't afford to have centers. Centers can't survive on 5 or 10 children being subsidized because they're at the lowest ranks of the economy. So I think there's a lot to think about. There's a lot of work being done. So we're being really good about staying focused on the national level and a regional level. I had regional meetings this past week, so that we are, like many other services, we need to be in sync, because if we stand up a bunch of childcare and other parts of the region don't, are we going to have a flood of people coming into the county using our care, and vice versa, right? So we have to be in sync with the region, just like we are with so many of the other. And I'll stop there and answer questions as we go through, and any issues you have, I'm happy to respond to.
Thank you, Ms. Otero. Vivian, did we miss anything from the packet?
I do have Councilmember Navarro that wanted to speak.
Oh, sorry about that.
Councilmember Navarro?
Thank you, and thank you, Ms. Otero, for your comments. I think, yes, we've been hearing a lot of stories, and this is kind of like uncharted territory as we move forward. I wanted to also say to Dr. Kroll, that it is true. It's interesting. This $183 million. There's so many ways in which we would like to prioritize using it. We're in a bind. The council received a budget that was prepared way before the pandemic hit, and the budget was predicated on property tax increases and things of that nature. And so, as we very quickly realized we were going to be facing some very, very stark, uncertain fiscal times, we also had a budget that we understood very clearly our residents could not endure. And so we're doing whatever we can, but I think that the good news is that the council is pretty much on the same page about some of these very important high priorities that we will, park for now. And then have to make some decisions. It is true. I mean, we have no idea what the fiscal situation is going to look like in 2, 3, 4, 5 months. We have no clue. But I think our residents should, rest assured that this is one that we have worked on so hard, and we still deem to be, a priority as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice President Hucker.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to Gabe and Nancy for their leadership on this issue over many years. Bibi, I apologize if you said this, but I was taken by your anecdote about the teacher changing into the uniform at the beginning of the day and the end of the day. This is all regulated largely at the state level, of course. Who at the state level is coming up with protocols for cleanliness and of the centers, of uniforms, of all that, so we have a window into the future? I've actually received a number of questions about this as providers and other private companies that are in this space are interested in figuring out what the world of the future looks like.
I think and others please chime in. I think the primary piece we've been looking at, and I think that MSD is also looking at, has been the guidelines from the CDC and HHS. And I'm happy to send, so Vivian can distribute with you the guidelines for childcare and summer programming type that have come out that are sort of being used as the base for making some decisions around cleaning, sanitizing, group sizes, those kinds of things. Much of what we do is driven by at the federal level by HHS, because so much of our funding comes out of the CCDBG dollars. And so a lot of the guidance is coming from there in terms of of utilizing. It was also a lot of the guidance about how to use those resources. Obviously, has come from the state, from the federal government. And I have to say, there were some very positive things at the very beginning in terms of how to utilize those resources, and guidance to states to be much more flexible, which is what has allowed us to be more flexible with subsidy dollars in terms of continuing to pay providers if they were already receiving subsidy, even though their enrollment may not be, children may not be enrolled. We've done the same. So we've mirrored ours the same with our WPA, for example. We've also supplemented some of what was in place for child care for essential workers. But basically, it's the HHS and the CDC guidance that we're all following.
Okay.
And some centers, of course, some places are adding their own, right?
Right.
Their own.
But voluntarily.
Right, exactly.
So providers and their contractors, it'd be fair to say they, if they are able to follow CDC and HHS guidelines, they shouldn't expect another layer of protections or mandates coming from MDH or from MSDE.
No, they shouldn't. Now, that said, we should consistently be in sync with our health director and what he believes are the right steps for us to take. And so I think that it's the combination of all of those. The baseline is what we're getting at HHS, and then we have to do what we think is best for our community, and based on what we get from our health director.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Councilmember Albornoz, it's back to you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ms. Yao, was there anything that we missed or that you'd like to highlight from this particular packet?
Just to reiterate, just so we have it in front of you, again, the continuity of services budget was about $5.99 million. The executive recommended $1.4 million above that. Of the existing appropriation for fiscal year 20, approximately $1.6 million will roll into fiscal year 21. But it sounds like having that information, it's ready for a motion if members are so interested.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would then like to move that we move forward with the council staff recommendations in the packet for a continuity of service budget.
Second.
Councilmember Rice has seconded it. All those in favor, please raise your hand. And that carries unanimously. Thank you very much. The next item is Children's Opportunity Fund. It's my understanding that this was also joint committee. And I don't know who did the rock, paper, scissors. No one told me. So should I turn it to you, Councilmember Albornoz, or should I turn to Councilmember Rice?
I beat him twice, so I get to go a second straight time.
Wow, I want to know your secret. Yeah, thank you.
I'm not very good at that game.
That's right.
I can see that.
Thank you, Mr. President. This will be brief because it is also a continuity of service budget. I just want to underscore, I happened to be there during the development of the Children's Opportunity Fund and have seen its evolution, and the reasons for its existence remain in place. There is this sweet spot where all of the youth serving organizations within different county branches of county government make significant policy decisions, but sometimes are only come together in relation to the budget. And so there was a need to create an organization that helped establish a common denominator, both with regards to policy, but also to better leverage private sector dollars where there was an investment in this kind of a work. And among the many things I've enjoyed working on with Councilmember Navarro, this was one of them in the development of this. And I do want to thank Kimberly for her partnership and her alliance. And I think this is going to be, the Children's Opportunity Fund is already doing important work, but that infrastructure, I think, presents some unique opportunities as we respond to COVID and the growing needs in every way imaginable. And so I'm very supportive of their work and really appreciate her leadership, and know that this will be an important tool moving forward for us to creatively get out of what we're seeing right now. And with that, I'll defer to Council Chair Rice to make any opening comments as well.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to be incredibly brief. I'm just happy to be in the room where it happened. And so certainly when it comes to Councilmember Navarro championing this, I was just really happy to be a part of that and able to vote yes and support her initiative, which I think was incredible, based, if I remember correctly, based on what we had seen that was happening down in Florida at the time. And so I don't want to steal any of Councilmember Navarro's thunder. I just really want to thank her, because some of the outcomes that as a result, I mean, we wouldn't have 2 schools that are now slated to go to full year of school if it weren't for the Bell program that was specifically came out of our Children's Opportunity Fund. I mean, there's so many successes, so many things to where all pieces are working together. And that's the collaboration that we need. And that's what the leverage and power of a Children's Opportunity Fund can do. So thank you, Councilmember Navarro. It's always great to be working with you on things that we know are changing the community for the better. And so I'm just really happy.
Thank you, Councilmember Navarro.
Thank you, Mr. President, and Councilmember Rice and Albornoz and Ms. Rasnak for all her work in this particular project. It is true that this was created in order for us to begin to test some different strategies, specifically to leverage private funding, with the caveat that it should be these should be projects that are of quality, have an evaluation component, and also are scalable. And that, I think, has been something that we on the council have been very clear about, that the importance of scalability is critical. Also, it was a way to practice if we ever would get to a dedicated funding stream for early care and education. And I feel like with the early care and education initiative, we have been pretty steady in ensuring that we would add money every single year. And the idea was that the Children Opportunity Fund can begin to be a place where we could practice what governance would look like if we were ever to move to a private-public governing structure. I will share, and many of you have had conversations, that of course MMF has been talking about how they can play that role in the near future. And these are things that we all are going to have to grapple with. The only thing I will say about this year, because of what we are all doing, is that I personally would prefer that whatever funds we're going to appropriate, that they go to continuity of services. In other words, to expand and enhance whatever we've done thus far. I am a little worried about starting new programs because, again, I feel like here we are talking about this macro issue of continuity of operations and only really focusing on those things that we know are COVID-19 related, recognizing that the impact is really hard, right? So if we talk about the Bell program, of course, it was an amazing partnership with the Rails Foundation, something that I helped facilitate with Josh Rails, had extraordinary impact, and it was private-public. It was amazing what we were able to do. So I personally am very interested in continuing in that vein. I think I expressed to Ms. Rasnak via email that I was not interested in really supporting new initiatives, small initiatives, because right now the need is so great. If we do have programs that have been already deemed to be of high quality and high impact, I would prefer that we invest dollars in pursuing and expanding that kind of approach. I feel very strongly, and I always have, that here in the county we're really good at funding a lot of little programs, but rarely do we really commit to scalability when it, and things that have been evaluated. So that's my only comment. I am not opposed to appropriating the dollars, but I would not support us starting new programs at this time. As I said again, I would rather us invest and leverage funds to expand those that are working, because our children specifically right now are going to need a lot. So that's my position, and I don't know how this fits in the recommendation from staff, but that's what I would like to share with all of you.
Thank you. Councilmember Jawando.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to my colleagues for all their great work in this area. I just wanted to say, Ms. Resnick, I think this public-private partnership, the idea of COF, what you've already been able to do, and bringing new experience to the table to expand and to really hone in on literacy like you did this year. I was so proud to participate, as I know many of my colleagues did, in the Reading Across Our County, Read Across America Day. That's going to be so important now. Every day I think about these students that some of which are not going to have any or very little instructional learning or reading, or people reading to them. If in the case of their parents, if they're working or essential workers, which we know are disproportionately our children of color and our low-income families. So the idea that we hone in on literacy at third grade as that key marker is going to be so important. So I'm really happy that you're doing that. I think we need to double down on this funding, the leveraged capacity of working with great organizations in the private sector and raising money there. Community Foundation has worked really well on that. I think this is going to be a huge piece of what we need to do to come out of COVID. So I just wanted to thank you for what you've done. I know you know what you're doing in your team, and we'll be very happy to support this funding. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councilmember Albanaz or Councilmember Rice?
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to turn it over now to Ms. Rusnick, if you'd like to make some opening comments with regards to the COF, and of course, Dr. Crowell as well, if there's anything you'd like to mention now before we take up the vote.
Sure. Thank you all for the time today. So I appreciate all the kind words. The Children's Opportunity Fund was created a few years ago by the leaders around this table, and I think right now, thinking about the COVID response, school closures have caused an unprecedented challenge for parents, teachers, and students and administrators. And it's exacerbated the already deep divide in educational equity in our county. And so even the most well-intentioned efforts to try to address low-income students during this time is going to be challenged. And so the Children's Opportunity Fund really stands ready to work with the County Council and the school system and other stakeholders to address these challenges moving forward. I hear what you're saying, Councilmember Navarro, about not really wanting to start anything new. Last summer, we adopted a new literacy focus, which is really focusing on birth to 8. There are 4 pillars in that: early care and education, community, family, and health. And so what we are proposing to do with the summer dollars related to kind of the carryover from the Bell program is really think about extended learning opportunities and supports to children throughout Montgomery County, especially those reaching out to families who are low income and Black and Brown students in our community, because we really are concerned about the COVID slide. And we're working in a coordinated effort to approach students and families through a trauma-informed lens, understanding that there's been a lot happening with students over the past 2 months as they're sitting at home. And so that's part of the work that we're doing. I think also it's exciting to hear about the work of the Early Care and Education Initiative and all that's been happening there. And Sharon sits on our steering committee, so she and I are working in tandem in terms of thinking about how the Children's Opportunity Fund can be of help and support with the early care and education challenges moving forward. So through the COVID crisis, the Greater Washington Community Foundation started a COVID response fund, and thus far we've raised over $6 million to support that, and thus far $1 million has come back to Montgomery County. And early care and education is definitely a key piece of what we're thinking about and looking at in that response fund as well. And I'm with you, Hans, in terms of thinking about how do we create this kind of plan of action to address getting back to normal and what we will need in terms of the child care supports for families. I'm at home with a 5 and a 7-year-old, so it is all very real to me. And so we're just excited to be of service and of help to figure out how to get Montgomery County to reopen and be supportive of children and families in Montgomery County. So thank you all for your time.
Thank you.
Dr. Crowell?
So yes, thank you. I think Ms. Rusnick talks about this. First of all, I want to say thanks to the Community Foundation for all of the support and partnership over the years. And I think that this is just another example. The Opportunity Fund is just another example of that partnership. especially around in the ability to bring philanthropic dollars to match and to partner with county funding as well, to create new ideas and new innovations in how we deliver service. I think that this is a time of continuity for us to make sure that we have that what the COF is doing, they can continue to do, but also as we think about this summer and into the fall, how do we manage to come up with new strategies and innovative strategies to get back to what will be our new way of doing business and work. So there, as a partner, I'm looking forward to continuing to work with them, especially around the school age issues and how we get resources and get our children, keep our children learning over the summer and help MCPS to get back to school, as well as helping to work on some of the issues of trauma that are going to be showing up over the summer and into the fall as we go back. So I'm looking forward to continuing the work.
Thank you, Dr. Crowell. And Councilmember Navarro mentioned earlier MMF, which I should have mentioned when we were discussing early childhood and education and care. They have been outstanding leaders in bringing together, in particular, our private sector into this discussion and in this space. Because as we acknowledge, government alone is not going to be able to fill this need. It will truly require a public and private, underscoring private, response to this. And so we will be having discussions moving forward about specifically the role that MMF will continue to play in the facilitation of this important conversation. When we are in a better position to catch our breath, hopefully that will happen sooner rather than later. We will revisit that topic along with a number of others when we can get back to the committee work. But just want to underscore and acknowledge their leadership in this important space and thank them and Sharon and the board and all of the respective members of that outstanding organization for their continued leadership. It's a model for other spaces and other initiatives that I think we can follow moving forward. And with that,
go ahead. You have a speaker. Councilmember Friedson.
Thank you. I just quickly wanted to, first of all, say I totally agree with everything that's been said, particularly by Chair Albornoz about the public-private partnership and the efforts that need to continue, and it'll be now needed more than ever before, as we have limited resources and greater needs, and really need to lean on those partnerships. I just had a question, appreciating all the comments that have been made by Councilmember Navarro about being intentional and strategic, also understanding the tremendous work that has been done and the need for those issues. I wasn't clear, honestly, on what the decision point would be on that particular item that was raised. I was just hoping for clarification on that.
Ms. Yao.
So right now the executive is recommending level funding for the Children's Opportunity Fund NDA, which is also the continuity of services level. It's $375,000. I believe Ms. Navarro had interest in providing context for how that funding would be used, and certainly we could, put a budget provision that includes that if that's the council's interest in doing that.
That's helpful. I'll yield to Ms. Navarro. I appreciated what she said and just wanted to understand how it was going to be operationalized and how we would move forward.
And I think that Ms. Navarro actually has a motion associated with that. So, Mr. President, we can yield to Ms. Navarro.
Very good. Councilmember Navarro, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. So yes, I would like to move the recommended funding level with the caveat that it would be utilized to enhance existing programs instead of creating new programs. As it was mentioned, a lot of great work has happened and a lot of really wonderful programs. And so what I propose is that we utilize these continuity of operations dollars to continue to provide those amazing services to our youth versus starting new programs.
It's been moved. Is there a second?
I'll second that.
It's been seconded by both Councilmember Albornoz and Councilmember Rice at the exact same time. So we're going to say it was Councilmember Albernoz. All those in favor, please.
Mr. President, sorry,
Yeah.
can I just ask a question? I'm still on the motion. I'm still not sure. I don't have a problem with it. I think
Just want to understand what it means.
Yeah, I just don't understand what it means. Yeah, that's my. Is that inconsistent with? Is that consistent with what Ms. Rusnick said about what they're working on, or is it? Maybe I'm just not understanding the point.
Policy group, which is comprised of the superintendent and myself and the executive, and I believe the president of the board, makes decisions about what programs might be adopted with the funding. What I'm recommending is that instead of pursuing new programs where you may, start a total new direction, that we fund those programs that were in place. Councilmember Joanna, you alluded to some of the literacy efforts, for example, the Dolly Parton program. There's still, some of the summer slide program. So that instead of, because we want to pursue continuity of operations, instead of pursuing new initiatives, that we use those funds to actually continue to provide the great kind of programs that have been implemented up until now. And so it would be consistent with our approach right now of not venturing into new things, but actually, and especially in this case, because these are amazing programs, enhancing those if possible, with leveraging private dollars, but not at this time begin to venture into new initiatives and new programs. So that is the motion. It might be that maybe for next year, we then, get a little more ambitious and add more funds to maybe test some new things. But that would be consistent with our original intent, which was to try to scale as much as possible those programs that have had really good outcomes. And in light of what's happening right now, it seems like that would be a really great way to use those dollars.
Thank you.
Councilmember Reamer, did you have anything else to add?
But just to clarify, the items that are described in the memo that we received, those presumably are within the continuity. So it's things that aren't written here today that could be proposed that we would say, listen, not this year. Is that do I have that correct?
Right. So, for example, right now there are programs with the Urban Alliance, some of like Thrive Germantown and things like that, which are doing really amazing. That's really incredible work. The idea is that this will be level funding to continue those programs versus starting to work on some new kind of initiatives. So, in other words, it's just consistent with our continuity of operations framework.
So the items that are in the memo are included in continuity. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
I have no other speakers. It has been moved by Councilmember Navarro, seconded by Councilmember Albernoz. All those in favor, please raise your hand. And that carries unanimously. Anyone opposed? No, that carried unanimously. Thank you very much. The next item, since we are skipping item 4, we deferred item 4, we're going to the utilities NDA follow-up. And I believe that's Councilmember Navarro.
Thank you, Mr. President. I believe this is TNE, no?
Vice President Hucker.
I think I made that mistake last time as well. So I'm consistent in my mistakes, but it's still a mistake. Council Vice President Hucker, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. We got into this a little bit and deferred. Why don't I let Mr. Levchenko remind us where we left things on this?
Sure. Well, the council discussed this item on April 28th, and they during that discussion, the council asked DGS staff and council staff to go back and look at the FY21 utilities budget again in light of the savings shown in the third quarterly analysis, as well as the potential impacts of COVID-19 on facilities, perhaps going into FY21. So staff did that, and I do have a revised recommendation based on that discussion. Basically, if you look on the cover sheet, page 2 of the sheet, has the additional reductions recommended by council staff, and they really fall into two parts. First, we looked at the traffic signals and streetlights portion of the utilities NDA, which has experienced some significant surpluses thanks to the high efficiency LED lighting retrofits I believe Council Vice President Hucker had mentioned at the last meeting. And I looked at the 18 and 19 surpluses and basically split the difference in terms of savings to project for FY21 for that. So there's staff's recommending $300,000 in savings related to that. And then in the buildings portion of the NDA, this is a little bit harder to work through, but staff's also suggesting another $300,000 there. It could come from additional utility savings from the additional COVID-19 impacts into FY21. The department is assuming about $175,000 in savings per month right now with the partial shutdown that we have. Perhaps in the first quarter of next year, we might see some level of savings below that, but that could be one area where those savings could come from. Could also come from some higher than expected building energy performance that you heard from Director Dice last time, that some of their buildings had experienced greater performance benefits than expected. You can't always presume that's going to happen going forward, but that is another area where there could be savings. And then the other factor that's hard to consider is weather. We had a very, very mild winter, which helps tremendously on the energy costs. We presume to project a moderate winter each year in the budget. And however, if we have another lighter winter, that's another place where savings could come from. But all of those combined, staff felt comfortable, given the discussions with DGS staff, of assuming $300,000 in the buildings portion of the NDA. So that would be a combined $600,000 below the executive's recommendation. The executive's recommendation was slightly below the FY20 budget. So combined, the savings would be, as noted on the first page of the cover sheet, the reduction from FY20 would be about $731,582. So staff is recommending that as a revised recommendation to be responsive to the council's inquiries from the last meeting.
Okay.
Council Vice President?
Mr. Dice, do you have anything to add or object to on this?
No objections. OMB staff, DGS staff, and Mr. Lipchenko, as he mentioned, did discuss this. We have looked at it. There are a number of assumptions employed, but I think based on what we're seeing, and none of us hope to actually have savings resulting from closed buildings because of the extended COVID, but based on what those things we can manage, we're comfortable with this.
Okay. This is terrific, Keith. I move the staff recommendation.
Thank you. It's been moved by Council Vice President Hucker. Is there a second? It's been seconded by Councilmember Reamer. All those in favor, please raise your hand. And that carries unanimously. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The next item is item 6, discussion of setting the real property tax revenues, the charter limit calculation. Is that Councilmember Navarro? I always think it is.
That is. I believe so, Mr. President.
See, if you go enough, if you make enough motions here or whatever, then eventually I can be right. Thank you, Councilmember.
Go.
Yours.
Go. So last Thursday, the council unanimously supported setting the real property tax revenues at the charter limit, and the majority of the council supported the income tax offset credit at $692. In previous years, these actions were sufficient for finance staff to calculate the tax rates for the coming fiscal year. It has come to the council's attention, however, that the executive recommended budget sets the real property tax revenues using a different method than prior years. This means there are 2 possible rates the finance could generate, not one like previous years. Council staff has prepared a report discussing the alternative interpretation that the executive used when calculating the charter limit. Included in the staff report are tables detailing the differences in revenues and tax rates based on a 30-year history for calculating the charter limit and the executive's proposed interpretation. Council staff will provide additional details about this report momentarily, but I want to highlight that the charter gives the council ultimate authority to set the levies on revenues. Therefore, the council must take an additional step today to clarify the total amount of real property tax revenues that it will levy at the charter limit today. I will now turn it over to Mr. Smith to briefly highlight items for this report, and after he is finished, then I will make some additional remarks. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Ms. Navarro. As you stated, we're going to take an additional step today, and ultimately the council will need to decide what number specifically they want to set for real property tax revenues at the charter limit. As you noted in the staff report, there are several items on background that I just want to quickly address. The first one is getting into the weeds a little bit about the charter limit calculation, but it simply is just letting the real property tax revenues that we collected last year grow by the rate of the consumer price index percentage growth, or inflation to call it in common parlance. And that limit there kind of gives the council the understanding of where the threshold is needed for 9 votes to exceed that limit. And so each year the council and the county government uses the term charter limit to kind of denote that threshold, and that's what we're going to talk about today. As I note in the staff report, finance uses 2 variables. The one is the real property tax revenues collected or estimated for current fiscal year, that's fiscal year 20, and then the CPI growth that happened in the last calendar year. The charter also lets the county exclude certain properties that have come online in the current fiscal year as additional revenue that the county can collect. That is not included in the charter limit calculation from the previous fiscal year, but it is used as part of the real property tax revenues collected and estimated in the current fiscal year. The primary area of difference this year for the council to discuss today is how the previous 30-year history of calculating the charter limit and the executive's current interpretation of what is new construction revenues. So as I note in the staff report on page 3, I apologize. When buildings come online, when they're new, the State Department of Assessments and Taxation will issue quarterly bills, 3/4, half, or 1/4 bills, depending on when that building actually comes online. And when that building comes online, it pays a prorated portion of what it would have paid for a full year's of taxes. I think the simplest way to think about this is on any given year, the county collects about 60% of the actual revenues that new construction buildings would have generated, and 40% is not collected because the buildings were not online for the full year. It fluctuates around that, but I think a 60-40 is a good ratio for the council to consider today. What the executive has recommended is that 40% that the county does not actually collect should be considered part of the charter limit base, part of the estimated property tax revenues that the county has collected. As noted in the previous 30 years, finance has only used actual property tax revenues. But again, the executive recommended using the full value of what we would have collected, again, about 40% additional revenues that were not collected. And as on page 4 notes, there's a slight difference in what the county would set as the tax rate based on this new calculation. Under the executive's proposed calculation, the tax rate would increase by about 0.25 cents or a quarter of a penny, and generate about an additional $5.2 million in fiscal 21. And so I quickly will walk through a couple of the questions council staff asked. This is not exhaustive, but it was a quick analysis given the time for the council to consider in its discussion. The first is, how does the executive's interpretation affect newly constructed properties? The answer is simple, it doesn't. SDAT will still issue quarterly bills. Those buildings will still pay whatever portion or prorated portion of the taxes they need to pay each year, and it will not impact newly constructed properties. For the existing ratepayers, though, under the executive's proposed, it will have a modest increase in the taxes this year and every year that the county sets revenues based on this new interpretation. Because again, it's putting about 40% additional revenues into the calculation that the county did not collect. And for comparison, council staff provides that at the median sales price, which is $450,000 in fiscal 20 and 21, it adds about $11.25 to that property tax bill for next year. Next is, Mr. Drummer is on the call with me as well if you have questions about this, but the question is this interpretation or is the charter limit calculation immutable? The simple answer is that the variables that finance use are not. Those are clearly stated in the charter. I think the question that the council will need to wrestle with today and the council staff has put into the packet is whether the term revenues is immutable for new construction. The previous interpretation had been we could only use actual revenues. Mr. Elrich has proposed using what we could have collected. And as council staff points out, that both interpretations feel slightly reasonable within the confines of the charter. Again, the residents of the county excluded new construction from the charter limit. However, for the last 30 years, we've been using a standard that appears to also not only be valid, but council staff believes was the intent of the original administrators as they interpreted this charter limit. Two more points real quick, as I know we're trying to get to lunch. Is the council exceeding the charter limit if it sets the tax rate at the executive's proposed value? As suggested in the packet, that is really up to the council. If the council decides today that the executive's interpretation is not valid or is not how to interpret the charter, but it wants to maintain the $5.2 million in revenues that's in the proposed budget, then it would be exceeding the charter limit. And as Mr. Drummer and I state, then the council needs to explicitly state that it's doing that. Obviously, if the council agrees with the executive's interpretation as calculated in the charter limit, then it would not be exceeding the charter limit. And so finally, as I propose, and as I turn it back over to Mr. Navarro, is really the question for the council today is which revenues does it believe needs to be set for the fiscal 21 real property tax levies? Is it using the charter limit calculation that finance had used from the previous 30 years, or is it using Mr. Elrich's proposed interpretation? And with that, I'll turn it back over to Mr. Navarro. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. So before I turn to my colleagues for comments or questions, I would like to make the motion that the council set real property tax revenues at the charter limit using the same methodology the county has used for the last 30 years. As the council has reiterated time and time again during this budget process, our residents and businesses deserve continuity in our budget. This is particularly important when it comes to proposed changes to such an important item as the county's tax revenues. Alterations to the charter limit methodology require detailed review and thorough public discourse, possibly even a charter amendment, we don't know, before the council adopts a change like this. So that I would like for that to be considered as it is my motion. Thank you, Mr. President.
Second.
Who was the second?
Friedson.
Friedson, all right. Everybody at once. Okay, thank you very much. It's Council Member Reamer.
Thank you. Thank you to the committee chair for her motion. I appreciate it very much. There's a lot to say here, and I think I'll make some comments, and then I imagine we'll cycle through, and maybe I'll come back and make some other comments. But the charter has the charter limit that we have it was written, and the language that was used creates a number of consequences that don't necessarily make a lot of sense, but that's the way they are. One of them we've been grappling with, which is how many council members it takes, and the fact that you have to be there to vote. And we considered a charter amendment because if a council member couldn't come to the council, then a unanimous vote would not be possible. There are a number of just strange things that have happened as a result, and one of them is the language of the charter amendment is very clear that it's revenue collected by the county. And as council staff has just explained, the average is we collect about 60% of the value of new construction. We don't collect 100% of the value of new construction. If we calculate the property tax based on 100% of the value of new
Excuse me, Councilmember, it's my understanding, I was just texted that the cable is out. Can our staff tell us whether our cable is out?
Who's cable? And who uses cable?
Well, whatever.
The county cable, and I understand there's some problems with the website too.
I'm at my office. I'm presently operating.
Well, and we appreciate that, but can we check with our county staff?
Oh, you mean like the broadcast on TV?
Yeah.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
We are checking right now, Mr. President.
Okay, thank you. We will hold
a pause for a minute then.
Yeah. We can freeze you. Yeah, there you go.
Give me a moment to collect my thoughts. I didn't expect to go first.
Apparently YouTube is okay, but it's the cable.
Okay.
It's for the millions watching at home.
Yeah.
And the YouTube is still live, FYI.
It's my understanding the YouTube is flashing as well. Okay. I think what we're going to do is we're going to recess this. The question in this meeting, the question is what time we're going to come back. Does their staff have, and I'm getting text here, does their staff have any suggestions what time we should come back? They're saying they may need 30 minutes. So why don't we say we're coming back at 1 o'clock?
Mr. President?
Yes.
Have less than they need, and we're just a conduit in that. And so 20 families a day is a lot. You know, imagine furnishing 20 homes a day. That's what we do every single day. The place is bustling. It's dynamic. The staff works incredibly hard every single day. So that's number one. The second thing we do is we provide job training, because of course you have to have a furnished home to think about what's next. I mean, you don't have to, but it certainly goes a long way if you can sleep in a bed at night to then do well in school the next day or do well at work the next day, right? A good night's sleep. We in all of the health literature, you hear that sleep is the most important thing. Well, try to get a good night's sleep if you're sleeping on a cold, dirty floor, or even a mattress that is, 30 years old, and a mattress that other people would never let their kids put their faces on. So we got to get rid of that, make sure everybody has their essentials. But then I've never seen anybody get out of poverty without a job. So we have to help people gain employment. And so a Wider Circle has this very individualized, comprehensive approach to helping people start from scratch, right? If you don't know what a resume is, we can start you with that. If you don't know how to translate a life where you haven't had a lot of job experience or maybe even a lot of educational experience, if you want to translate that onto a resume and be appealing to an employer, we can help with that. And we do that not only through our own expertise, but in engaging volunteers from the community. So many Montgomery County residents are job coaches here at a Wider Circle.
A Wider Circle provides job training, job search training, workforce development. There's clothing. You can get yourself a new wardrobe to go. You can practice interviewing. If you're having housing insecurity, you have access to people who can figure out how you might improve shelter for yourself, where you might go. So working with other agencies and taking a holistic approach to clients, and then you're a partner with them or with the family, working through the structural inequities that leave a lot of folks stuck in poverty. I loved that idea. It was very different from other kind of anti-poverty initiatives that I knew about. And so when I retired from a life of teaching,